It is well that the reader accept nothing which follows as objective truth. For since the events transcend natural law, they are necessarily the subjective and unreal creations of my overtaxed mind. When I attained the conning tower, I found the sea in general far less luminous than I had expected. There was no animal or vegetable phosphorescence about, and the city that sloped down to the river was invisible in blackness. What I did see was not spectacular, not grotesque or terrifying, yet it removed my last vestige of trust in my consciousness. For the door and windows of the undersea temple, hewn from the rocky hill, were vividly aglow with a flickering radiance, as from a mighty altar flame far within. Later incidents are chaotic. As I stared at the uncannily lighted door and windows, I became subject to the most extravagant visions, visions so extravagant that I cannot even relate them. I fancied that I discerned objects in the temple, objects both stationary and moving, and seemed to hear again the unreal chant that had floated to me when first I awaked. And over all rose thoughts and fears which centered in the youth from the sea, and the ivory image whose carving was duplicated on the friezed columns of the temple before me. I thought of poor Cleanse, and wondered where his body rested with the image he had carried back into the sea. He had warned me of something, and I had not heeded. But he was a soft-headed Rhinelander, who went mad at troubles a Prussian could bear with ease. That is from The Temple, an early story by H.P. Lovecraft. We are done with the official Cthulhu mythos, and now we are exploring some of the earlier stories of H.P. Lovecraft. And in fact, as I was going through this book, The Complete Fiction of H.P. Lovecraft, I came across a whole bunch of stories I actually want to talk about. So it turns out we've got a little while to go here on Mythos Monday because there's a few H.P. Lovecraft stories I think are worth talking about, including this one, The Temple by H.P. Lovecraft. I want to read you something that S.T. Joshi, the editor of so many great books about and of H.P. Lovecraft, has written. The longest story of Lovecraft's early career, The Temple, was apparently written in the latter half of 1920, possibly August 20th, a date cited in the tale and Lovecraft's 30th birthday. It is marred by somewhat clumsy and obvious satire against the German protagonist of the tale, and also by a plethora of supernatural details that do not seem to fuse into a unity. But its portrayal of the narrator's gradual descent into madness is powerful. It was the first of Lovecraft's stories not to appear in an amateur journal prior to its publication in a professional venue. Its first appearance was in Weird Tales for September 1925. I agree with most of what S.T. Joshi has written there. Definitely the obvious satire against the German protagonist. That's pretty heavy-handed, I have to say. I do disagree, though, about the supernatural details not fusing into a unity. I believe they do, in fact. I think the tale makes a kind of sense in that regard. So this is a story about a German submarine in World War I, the First World War, and it's commanded by Karl Heinrich Graf von Altberg Ehrenstein, lieutenant commander in the Imperial German Navy, and in charge of the submarine, the U-29. So this guy, the commander, he's a little over the top, this guy. Really over the top, typical evil German commander of the U-boat. In the very beginning of the story, he attacks the British freighter Victory. He destroys the freighter, and as the sailors are trying to escape in the lifeboats, as the ship is sinking, our evil commander has them shot as they're trying to escape death in the boats, and it's pretty grim. Our commander, no mercy, this guy. So we know right away he's not the greatest fellow in the world, this commander. He is an interesting character. He is over the top. He is kind of a satire, but he's also kind of an interesting guy, and he's not without his good points, this fella. Really level-headed guy, this commander. And pretty brave, actually. He shows a lot of courage as the story goes on. He's just, evil. So there's that. So after the Victory sinks, I want to read just a couple paragraphs just to show you where this story is going. When we rose to the surface, about sunset, a seaman's body was found on deck, hands gripping the railing in a curious fashion. The poor fellow was young, rather dark, and very handsome, probably an Italian or Greek, and undoubtedly of the Victory's crew. He had evidently sought refuge on the very ship which had been forced to destroy his own. One more victim of the unjust war of aggression which the English pig dogs are waging upon the fatherland. Our men searched him for souvenirs, and found in his coat pocket a very odd bit of ivory carved to represent a youth's head crowned with laurel. My fellow officer, Lieutenant Clens, believed that the thing was of great age and artistic value, so took it from the men for himself. How it had ever come into the possession of a common sailor, neither he nor I could imagine. As the dead man was thrown overboard, there occurred two incidents which created much disturbance amongst the crew. The fellow's eyes had been closed, but in the dragging of his body to the rail, they were jarred open, and many seemed to entertain a queer delusion that they gazed steadily and mockingly at Schmidt and Zimmer, who were bent over the corpse. The boatswain Mueller, an elderly man who would have known better had he not been a superstitious Alsatian swine, became so excited by this impression that he watched the body in the water, and swore that after it sank a little it drew its limbs into a swimming position, and sped away to the south under the waves. Clens and I did not like these displays of peasant ignorance, and severely reprimanded the men, particularly Mueller. So, we have some supernatural events happening right away here in this story. So things go from unsettling to terrible in this German submarine. There is a mysterious explosion that happens in the engine room. Now, if you're on a submarine in a fantastic story that there's going to be an explosion in the engine room. That's pretty much a given. And sure enough, it happens. And they lose control of the navigation of the submarine, so they're just adrift and probably doomed. And this makes the men very upset. And at one point, they see off in the distance a U.S. Ship, and they decide, hey, let's surrender so we can, not die. But our commander, he's not having any of that. And he refuses, of course, to surrender. He would rather die. And a lot of his men get very mutinous. And so, being the kind of commander that he is, he has those men shot. So, things go from terrible to more terrible on the German U-boat. And the surviving men start to see things. They start to imagine that they see that youth floating around outside the portholes. And they start to kind of go crazy. And things just end up awfully here. And Eventually, we only have a couple of men left. We have the commander and Cleanse, his fellow officer. And wouldn't you know it, Cleanse starts to go mad too. Now, at some point, they lose the ballast, so they're underwater and cannot surface, and they're just drifting along, and they're kind of forced into this, going in this one strange direction. And outside the portholes, there are a bunch of dolphins kind of floating along, where it's far too deep for these dolphins to really exist in this deep under the sea. So it's weird that they're there in the first place. It's all that itself is pretty spooky. And Clem starts to believe that he hears a voice, and eventually Cleanse tries to kill the commander, and eventually he kills himself, for which the commander is kind of relieved. The dolphins outside the window, by the way, I've read a little bit more of S.T. Joshi's opinions on this story, and he believed that that was one of the strange things about the story. He didn't really think the weird dolphins outside the windows really went along. Excuse my terrible monstrous dog in the corner. He didn't really think that the dolphins really went along with the story. In my opinion, they did. And the reason why is because eventually this submarine ends up floating above a submerged ancient city. Possibly the ancient city of Atlantis. You know, if you're in a submarine in a fantastic story, there's a pretty good chance you're going to come across the ruins of Atlantis. That's just the way it goes. And so this submarine gently descends and rests at the bottom of the sea, right outside, right next to a temple that is carved into the rock there, an ancient temple. And so my opinion is that there's something in this temple, some force, some supernatural force, which is guiding the submarine there. It's bringing the commander there for a specific purpose. And the undead youth who's floating around out in the water, and the dolphins that are strange out there, I think that they're all part of that. They're all guiding the submarine where it's going. At least that is my interpretation. One of the interesting things about this story is that there's a lot of ways you can interpret what's going on. H.P. Lovecraft doesn't spell it out. About all you really realize is that there are some supernatural things happening in this story. And to me, it all works. Eventually, our commander sees some lights and some other things going on in this temple. I won't really give you the entirety of what is going on and what happens to our commander. You kind of get the idea, because this is a Lovecraft story and he's the protagonist. Things are not going to go well for him. This is a found manuscript story. His manuscript was found in a bottle, or he left it in a bottle to be found. Found manuscripts are a very popular framing device in these old stories. Just as found footage is a popular kind of genre or subsection of the horror genre today in the films. And to me, this story works remarkably well. I like it an awful lot. I think it's one of his best early stories. I think it's really effective. You really get a great sense of place in this story. The claustrophobic submarine trapped beneath the waves, all the crew going mad. It's just really grisly, and it has just this overwhelming sense of dread going through the whole thing. A really strong early story, despite some of the things that just aren't perfect about it. So it's really interesting, and it's one of those early stories that I highly recommend. If you have a volume with this story in it, definitely read it. It's one of those stories you can get pretty easy. You can get all of H.P. Lovecraft pretty easily if you read ebooks. You can get all his stuff. It's all in the public domain. You can get it all really cheap. Or you can just buy a big sucker like this. It's worth it, man. So yeah, The Temple by H.P. Lovecraft, your Mythos Monday for today. Catch me next week for another Mythos Monday, where we'll be talking about another early story of H.P. Lovecraft. And catch me tomorrow, because it's Tag Tuesday tomorrow, so I will see you then here at Stately Vaughan Manor. Bye, guys.